I am new to this congregation, of course, and I don't typically write out my sermons, and so I'm not knowing how long this is going to be. But I have a clock here, so I can cut things short. I recall a pastor once was preaching with a group like yourselves, and there was a gal in the front here who was just kind of fidgeting the whole sermon after a while, looking at her watch. And have you ever faced that? And the pastor started getting a little bit self-conscious about this. And after the sermon, as he was greeting the people coming out, this lady came, and he said, "I'm sorry. I noticed that you were a little bit getting a little restless. I'm sorry the sermon went so long." And she said, "Oh, no. It wasn't long. It just seemed long." So I hope if this is long, it doesn't seem long to you. Anyway, I do have an old saying I've told congregations: if you get done listening before I'm done preaching, feel free to leave. You know, I won't be offended at all. Today I was thinking about Paul's letter to the church at Philippi, and in the first part of that letter, at one point he writes, "I thank my God for every remembrance of you." Well, there was a pastor on sabbatical, and he did make a point of regularly writing back to the congregation about what was happening as his sabbatical unfolded. And then the next Sunday, the worship leader would read what the pastor was saying about his sabbatical. Only the problem is, one time there was a typo, and the pastor meant to say these words that I just spoke with you from Philippians. "I thank my God for every remembrance of you," but the typo made it sound like this when the person read the letter. "I think my God whenever I remember you." If you wrap your mind around that, you know. So I am aware that in my life there are occasions when I say, "Thank God," and other times I say, "My God." I don't have many remembrances of Creekside Church of the Brethren yet, but I've had some connections that I have been animated by. I really do appreciate the stories of hospitality. In fact, Tim and your wife Diane, is she in the choir here? Yeah. I really appreciated your answering questions in the "Who's Your Neighbor" section of the aptly named connection for Creekside Church of the Brethren. I find the stories of hospitality very compelling as well. I have really been appreciative of the two pastors here, Elizabeth and Rosanna. Elizabeth sharing on February 2nd about welcoming the stranger. I really resonated with her sensitivity and storytelling approach. Last Sunday, I really valued your very transparent and thoughtful narrative, Rosanna. I am appreciative of the hospitality shown with me by some folks last Sunday, Cal and Jean Mangraber, and the Ann and her husband, and I think it was your mother, right? Kathy Royer. We broke bread over the noon hour. I'm looking forward to that with you, Angie, at some point. Not just breaking bread, but breaking the bread of our stories was really what's important to me. I anticipate that the conversation that you'll be having after this worship hour in regards to the temple of God's grace will also be very enlightening and enlivening, considering how you're going to go forward or not with that group. So as I considered today, I thought perhaps the best thing I could do was to share with you parts of my story that relate to these scriptures. And it's risky to do that because you might say, thank God, or you might say, my God, I run that risk. But to me, it's worth the risk. And I hope it's not just about me. It's how maybe your story can kind of find some connecting points with my story as we all try to bring it under God's story. My story began at birth, and I think that there's going to be some, Gary's going to called. Some of you know what a caul is, a C-A-U-L. Maybe some of you do not. That's a membrane that covers the newborn baby, and is usually broken through before the baby is born. Over time, the caul has been seen as a sign of blessing, protection, good luck. In literature, one metaphor for the caul is part of Jesus' nightgown, whatever that means. I was covered with a caul at birth when I came out of my mother's womb. My mother was aware of some of the lore surrounding cauls, and at that point, she was akin to Hannah when Samuel was born. She told me this later. God, this boy is yours. So from I take that mystery very seriously because from very early on, I felt loved by God. Different spiritual writers have said that a mystic is someone who's in love with God. And so that first song, Santo, Santo, talks about loving God. That's a song for the mystics among us. I believe we all are in some way or another. I felt safe. I felt like I belonged from very early on in my life. I remember sitting out under the stars at night and just feeling safe and embraced by a God. Although in those days I couldn't put any words to it really. But it wasn't long before called got cold. I grew up the son of a tomato farmer. And my dad used to take the tomatoes in these hampers. He'd kind of stack them on a wagon and take them into the tomato cannery in Pandora, Ohio. And there would be an inspector there. His name was, I think, Ellis or Elvis Plank. I just remember for sure the last name. And then he would take hampers off the wagon and test them. And then rate the whole wagon load according to those hampers that he chose from the wagon. My dad was a good guy, but he played the game. So he would have me pick 10 really good hampers of tomatoes. No culls in them at all. And then he'd place them, he would chart where this guy usually picked off the hampers, and then he'd put those hampers in those places where he thought the inspector would take them. It worked for a while, but after a while, the inspector got on to my dad. And he always got hampers in which there were culls. Culls are the ones that are less desirable. Well, in my life, this life of belonging, wasn't long before that life got culled. I'm not faulting my parents. I think all of us go through this. But after a while, behavior kind of trumped belonging. And then growing up in the church, the Mennonite church in Ohio Belief began to trump belonging. I felt I belonged from the beginning, but after a while I wondered, but my behavior is not right. My beliefs aren't right. And it goes on in life that way for me. It has for me anyway. The Shema, which you can read in Deuteronomy chapter 4. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God. The Lord is one. And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and strength. And then it goes on to say, you shall tie it on your doorpost and tell your children. It's one of the first prayers of Jewish children. This was my prayer, basically, as a youngster. But the Shema has the same letters as shame. And it wasn't long before shame began to become more dominant in my life. That is, it wasn't just what you did that needs to be called, it's who you are. And that can be to me, a very damaging thing. Has anyone here, like myself, had an experience at camp, church camp, where you gather around the campfire at night and they hand you out these pieces of paper and you write on there, the bad stuff about you. And then you do what? Throw it in the fire, just like hellfire, kind of thing. That didn't enhance my life at all. As a young, it brought some fear into things. Called. And then called. I'm looking at the screen back here to remind me what I'm supposed to say. Has anyone here heard of Donald Call? Probably not. I grew up with Donald Call in Iowa. He is a writer. He's a writer for the Des Moines Register. He's one of the founders of the RAGBRAI, the Register's Great Bicycle Ride Across Iowa. If any of you are familiar with that, you bike riders. He now lives in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And every once in a while, I'll go online, Google Call, and just see what he's writing about these days. Well, he's not writing much anymore. He's almost 80 years old. But last December, he had a posting. And he was reflecting about being a young reporter at the Des Moines Tribune 50 years before. He was 27 years old, had 2 kids, just leased a house, and he was not very good at what he did. He'd get pictures and identification mixed up. He was given the Christmas beat, he says, 50 years ago, and he just got everything messed up. There was a department store giving out toys for kids, and he rode over there to the store with the cab driver, but he got the quotes of the cab driver and the department store manager mixed up, and the cab driver was complaining. So it didn't come off well. There was a photo contest in Des Moines, and he got somehow, he didn't know how it happened, but he got a picture of a manger scene and Santa on a housetop reversed. And so this one thing after another was going wrong. And he went into the office, and his city paper editor came to him and said, Call, you're not going to make it. Oh, by the way, it's Christmas Eve. Go home and enjoy yourself. Well, he called that exquisite cruelty. He went home just silent and just sat there, wounded, for a long time. And finally his wife came to him and said, What's the matter? He said, my editor tells me I'm not going to make it. And she said, oh, what does he know? He looks like his mother dressed him. You're going to make it. He said, hey, with a wife like that, how could I not make it? And he did. When I was 27 years old, living in Wayland, Iowa, 2 children. I wasn't very good at what I did as a pastor. I'm not that good now, but I was less good then. And I remember I got this message. It was like November, December. I went there in September. After 3 months, I could sense the rumblings and messages of you're not going to make it. Well, my wife Paulette has always been my advocate and support, and she kind of reaffirms you're going to make it. But this particular time, I had a dream at night. I woke up, and it wasn't a dream. It was a reality. There was some dark presence in the room. I was paralyzed. I could not move because I wanted to reach over to Paulette for help and support because she was sleeping like a baby, as she still does. I've learned if I get paralyzed in the night, don't reach for Paulette But I was absolutely frozen. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't move. Finally, in desperation, what did I say? Any guesses? My God would be a good one. I said, Jesus. And the power of darkness is broken just like that. I learned something that night. That doesn't matter what others thinks about. Another thinks about you going to make it or not. It's the voice of God that makes the difference of whether you're going to make it or not. Called. C-A-L-L-E-D. I forget when it was. This is some years later. And this is why I chose the passage from 1 Corinthians today, because it was so much of a personal journey of mine too, like it was with Paul. I don't know if Elizabeth or Rosanna or any of you here who've pastored have ever had these moments when the sermon's over, the Sunday's almost over, and you walk into a room, by surprise, and you see the deacons huddling. And you just had this sensing, they're talking about me. And they loved me, but basically the message was, Doug, I don't think you're going to make it. Well, that night, I had a dream. And in the dream, I was in court. And the voices of opposition to me were very loud and strident. There was a gal who appeared in the dream who was an advocate in that congregation who tried to speak up in the court and give her own testimony, but she was shouted down. And then there was a voice. And the voice said, turn to Psalm 116. It's enough if I would bless your teachings. Well, it's already 11:15. I'll at least finish the story. When I got up in the morning, what did you think I did? I went to the New International Bible sitting on my dresser drawer and opened it. And where was it open to, do you think? Psalm 116. That got my attention. I did not even know what Lectio Divina was in those days. I never heard of Lectio Divina, or spiritual reading. But I basically practiced Lectio Divina with Psalm 116. What am I supposed to see here? And the portion of Scripture that Elizabeth read was the key in verses 14 and 18. I will fulfill my vows to the Lord in the presence of all his people. It was spoken twice. It's a doublet. I took it as God's personal word to me. live out my vows faithfully to the Lord in the midst of his people. For this 6 months, it's with you folks. I'll say more about what that vow is later. You haven't got time today. I hope this is not seeming long, but it's getting long. So I won't do what I was really going to do today, except to say that I chose the passage from 1 Corinthians because of my identification with Paul. Paul was in the midst of a hotbed of controversy. Some were on Apollos' side, some were on Cephas' side, some were Paul's people. I guess you have that option here. If you choose that, you can be Rosanna's gang, or you can be Elizabeth's gang, or you can be Doug's gang. You know, it's wrong. That's not how it's supposed to be. Paul was feeling a bit threatened by that, but then he came out of it. He probably got some messages, you're not going to make it, Paul. He came out of it saying, we're stewards of God's mysteries. I don't care if you or anybody else tries me in court. I don't even judge myself. I'm not even saying I'm acquitted. All I know is this: God's got the last word. That's what I speak this day. That's what I feel for these other two gifted pastors that you've got here, Rosanna and Elizabeth. They are who they are. They bring their own special gifts to the table. We all have stuff in us that people would like to shame and throw away. Jesus told the disciples in John, when he was sharing the bread and the fish from that little boy with the crowd, gather all the fragments so that nothing is lost to you. I identify with that barley bread. Barley is the bread of the poor. I play with words. I call it barely bread because sometimes in my life I've been barely hanging on. Can you imagine that bread saying, in the end, when it got picked up, I'm not sure what's getting over me. I'm still barley bread. I'm barely hanging on. But my God, I'm now alive. I'm not lost. Again, time's up. So I'll share at least one image with you. Have you seen something like this ever? Surely you have. We've had this for 45 years in our marriage. I think someone gave it to us at a wedding shower, thinking we'd probably have kids someday. Creekside Church of the Brethren. Do you have blue states and red states among you here at Creekside? Probably, yeah. The blue and the red. We have them all. We have all these pieces. This can be my person. This can be this body. We have all kinds of shapes among us. And sometimes people want to tell us, you don't fit. This doesn't fit. Cast it out. Get rid of it. That's not Jesus' approach. Yeah. You can't put a square in a round hole, but it fits the square hole, and so forth, and so on. I hope we can be the kind of people that, not just in our inner selves, where I'm a mixed bag. I can be a jerk. I can be a jewel. I can be wild. I can be tame. I've got the prodigal son in me. I've got the elder brother in me. I have the head, I have the heart. I have contemplative side, I have an activist side. There have been people over the year, I have my liberal side and my conservative side. There are people over the years who want to cast out one or the other. That's not God's approach. God kind of holds all things together, gathers up the fragments so that none are lost. And so it is with you, I believe. Are there liberals here and conservatives here? Yes, probably. What are you? He was raising his hand back there. I thought, not. Well, those same categories I just mentioned, I'm sure they're all embodied here. You may be tempted to cast them out or to shame them. That's not Jesus' work. He gathers them all up, gathers them all in, transforms them, gives them new life, and brings out of that a marvelous, miraculous, mysterious community of the Spirit. I would close with the words from John again, but you saw them earlier. Even if we accuse ourselves or judge ourselves, God is greater than our accusing hearts, and gives us that stamp of beloved. May it be so.